Israelis went to voting booths Tuesday for the second time in 5 months. Several early exit polls suggest Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's re-election bid might fall short. Seth Doan is in Tel Aviv with the latest on where things stand.
This is election night headquarters for the Likud party, which is headed by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. You can hear music, but very muted celebrating tonight. That is because it is simply too close to call. There's a bit of a nationwide sense of deja vu here, as it is not yet clear who has won this election. Now, this is a parliamentary system. There are 120 seats in Israel's parliament called the Knesset. 61 is the key number. That is the number needed to form a government. Now, it is clear that no one party will be able to form a government on its own, so a coalition will be needed. The real question now is, what will that coalition be made up of? And that is the kind of backroom dealing that will be the next phase of this. Now, in this electioneering, in this campaigning, we saw U.S. President Donald Trump playing a very big role. He was almost put on the ticket in a way by Benjamin Netanyahu, who is underlining his close relationship with the president. The U.S., of course, has given some real policy wins to Israel. But his chief competitor is Benny Gantz from the Blue and White Party. Gantz is a centrist, he's more secular, and he has been criticizing Netanyahu for being seen as corrupt. And in fact, Netanyahu is facing corruption charges, and he would be looking to try to create a parliamentary majority that would grant him immunity. Elaine?
Seth Doan, thank you. Joining me now from Washington is Dan Raviv. He's the senior Washington correspondent for I-24 News. Dan, great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
Can you remind us, first of all, why Benjamin Netanyahu is being investigated?
Well, starting with that, are you? A lot of Israeli voters have certainly known for well over a year that there are various fraud and bribery allegations against Israel's prime minister. In general, they do not involve money into his pocket. A little more complicated than that he was exchanging favors that had to do with good media coverage in exchange for helping somebody with a certain company, also receiving cigars and champagne from a very rich supporter of his. He said, that's not bribery. That guy's always been a friend of mine. But still, the Attorney General takes it seriously. So there are 3 cases against Netanyahu, and there are hearings scheduled in early October in which, well, if Netanyahu is not the prime minister, he could be absolutely put on trial. If he is the prime minister, kind of like here in America, almost for sure the chief executive would not be put on trial, Elaine.
So the election appears to be too close to call, but I'd like to get some context. Tell us about these 2 candidates, Benjamin Netanyahu and Benny Gantz, about their backgrounds and their respective parties.
Sure. One thing to keep in mind, in fact, is that when Israelis go to vote, they don't vote for an individual. You're not voting for Netanyahu or Benny Gantz. You're simply putting in one piece of paper representing the party you support. Then all the votes all over the country are added up, and there's proportional representation in Parliament, in the Knesset. And then based on who controls a majority in the Knesset, somebody gets to be prime minister. So it's very, very indirect, but it is clear it's either Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. It's either Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu continuing in that post, or it's Benny Gantz, who was the military chief of staff under Netanyahu. Now, Gantz didn't used to be a political guy. He formed this new party called Blue and White early this year. Mostly, in fact, to get Netanyahu out of office. There are many Israelis who are fed up. They've had enough of Netanyahu. Of course, he does have his followers, and that's why we've got this almost kind of 50-50 result, at least according to the exit polls. You know, real numbers are still some hours away, Elaine.
So, Dan, if the election produces a deadlock, what options does Benjamin Netanyahu have moving forward?
Well, it depends on the president of the country. Reuven Rivlin is his name. And he has to look at the situation. And under Israeli tradition, he has to consider which politician has the best chance of putting together a coalition required to have 61 seats out of the 120 in parliament. So he might choose Netanyahu and say, OK, Netanyahu, you get the first shot at it. Now, that usually would be the leader of the party that has more seats than anybody else. So it could be the Blue and White Party. party, could be Likud. Again, the exit polls aren't totally clear on this. So the president would give the first man chosen 3 weeks, generally, in order to try to put together a coalition. Early this year, Netanyahu had his shot at it and just could not succeed. They did not manage to build a coalition, and that's why we have another election now, 5 months after the other one this year. It could be that he gives Netanyahu a chance, and then he gives Benny Gantz a chance, and then he gives someone else a chance, or back to Netanyahu. All in all, this could take weeks, Elaine.
So it could take weeks. In the meantime, what would be the reaction you might expect from the Trump administration as this gets hashed out?
Well, I'd say that Donald Trump has made no secret of the fact that he considers Benjamin Netanyahu a personal friend, not just a political ally. And early this year, it was clear that President Trump was trying to help Netanyahu. During that election campaign in March and April, that's when President Trump announced the United States recognizes that the Golan Heights, captured from Syria, is part of Israeli sovereign territory. A big favor to Netanyahu after, of course, earlier favors like moving the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. This time, nothing that major, in fact. President Trump did this past weekend say he was on the phone to Netanyahu. They talked about a possible mutual defense treaty. Again, everyone assumes that Trump would prefer Netanyahu. He's the Israeli that Trump knows. On the other hand, at the White House, they apparently know that Benny Gantz is okay, former military chief of staff, a lot of contacts in the Pentagon. So I'm not sure that the Trump administration will say much of anything. A lot of Israelis think that Trump will keep trying to help Netanyahu, even now, to form a coalition. On the other hand, President Trump may decide better hands off. Either way, Trump intends to be still friendly toward Israel.
Interesting. Well, we know that the Trump administration plans to release an Israeli-Palestinian peace plan soon. How could the outcome of this election affect the rollout of that plan, if at all?
Well, they kind of affect each other, and that's why the White House decided not to roll out the plan during the Israeli election campaign. So do it now, during coalition building? That would seem very strange. But if there's something in there that would look really good for Netanyahu, like the United States agrees with Netanyahu that parts of the West Bank should be annexed by Israel. Wow, if the peace plan says that, that would seem to strengthen Netanyahu, and maybe the Trump White House would do it. Again, I doubt it, but it might. There also could be elements of the peace plan that, in fact, would be tough on Netanyahu, requiring that Israel pull back from some of the West Bank territory. So it's a big mystery. President Trump, frankly, hasn't approved going ahead with this plan that was developed mostly by his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. We've been waiting for it for more than 2 years. Would they issue it, like, next week? I'll be surprised, but yeah, you do get surprises.
All right, Dan Raviv in Washington. Dan, thank you very much.
Okay.